Climate change affects every aspect of life, damaging food systems, displacing millions, shaping the future of conflict. Climate change is a story of extremes, increasing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, weather extremes becoming everyday weather. The majority of climate security risks today revolve around water distress. Climate change will continue to affect the availability of natural resources around the world. While some regions will likely see their water supply drop under probable CO2 emission scenarios, other parts will likely get more water over coming decades. But these changes will often manifest in extreme ways, such as prolonged dry seasons followed by erratic and intense precipitation. How do these changes affect marginalized communities and shape conflict dynamics? An extreme climate leads to extremely harsh living conditions.
Across the Sahel, changing rainfall patterns have increased competition among farmers and herders over fertile soil, contributing to increased violence between the two groups, such as the deadly 2018 clashes in Nigeria. Across the Horn, more frequent and intense weather events, droughts and floods alike, cause massive displacement and instability, like the 2020 floods in South Sudan that displaced people and helped fuel violence in Equatoria. Across the world, governments and non-state actors like jihadis and gangs also use climate change strategically, from Al-Shabaab exploiting people's anger at the state's failure to bolster their ranks and influence in Somalia, to gangs in Mexico providing services in the aftermath of disasters in a bid to win support.
Climate change is clearly a threat, but under the right circumstances, it can provide an opening for cooperation between conflict parties.
We identify these risks and opportunities by blending field insight with climate science and state-of-the-art quantitative methods using satellite imagery, climate forecasting data, and spatial analysis. Visit crisisgroup.org/climate to learn more.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Rob Bletcher, and I am the director of Crisis Group's Future of Conflict program. We appreciate your presence here today, all the more so at a very, very busy time of the year, an intense period for the conflicts and crisis situations that we all work on. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, Crisis Group is an independent organization working to prevent, mitigate, and resolve conflict through on-the-ground research, high-quality analysis, and direct engagement with conflict actors and key international players, like many of you today on this call, in order to encourage informed and intelligent international action and local action and regional action. In this crisis talk event, as we call it, we will address the intersection between climate change and violent conflict and exchange on the ways in which climate change is transforming conflicts or fragile political settings. Our climate work is part of Crisis Group's Future of Conflict program, which examines new threats and risks of conflict, as well as new ways of addressing them. We are very pleased today that participants include policy practitioners, regional experts, and diplomats working on peace and security from the European Union and its member states, as well as colleagues from civil society and international organizations elsewhere. This crisis talk is part of an ongoing collaboration with the EU, and I wish to acknowledge the partnership with the European Commission through the instrument contributing to stability and peace, and the collaboration with the European External Action Service. Thank you for your support. I am now handing over to my colleague Hugh Pope, who will moderate your panels.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hugh Pope, the Director of Communications and Outreach here at Crisis Group headquarters in Brussels. I'm a former reporter and Turkey-Cyprus project director for Crisis Group, and I'll be your moderator today. As you've seen from the invitation, you know that we'll have 3 sessions and we'll be going on for 2 hours to cover that. So get ready. The first is on how climate change relates to violent competition for dwindling resources. The second on how climate change drives longer-term issues of displacement and migration. And the third will be on the strategic risk that climate change poses for states and for the opportunities being exploited by non-state actors. To discuss all this, we have 6 expert panelists. And you should know that this session will also be on the record. It's being live streamed on YouTube. Rob Letcher, who you just heard from, is the director of Crisis Group's Future of Conflict program, which covers not just climate change, but the global economy and digital technologies, especially social media. Rob is a long-serving veteran of Crisis Group, working particularly on Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East and North Africa. He has a PhD on the history of the Middle East, which is in some cases an object lesson on how climate change can really affect countries, and especially historically, thousands of years, it's completely changed the face of the region. And then we have Alan Boswell, also from Crisis Group. He is our senior analyst for South Sudan since 2018. Prior to that, he was a journalist covering the many struggles of the world's newest country. He's also the host of one of Crisis Group's most listened to podcasts, The Horn. And thirdly, from Crisis Group, we have Ulrich Eberle. He's one of Crisis Group's first fellows for climate change and conflict, as we try to build up our expertise in quantitative analysis. He is an expert on what exactly is causing conflicts between, for instance, herders and farmers, especially in Nigeria, and the violence associated with the building of dams. And we have 3 guests from outside the organization. There's Chris Hodder, is the UN Environmental Advisor on Somalia. And I believe his job represents the first time there's been a climate advisor to a peacekeeping mission. And he's a specialist in public health originally and climate change and disaster management. Since then, working all over the world from West Africa to Nepal, Chad, DR Congo, and Haiti. We also have with us Kaylee Ober, who is with Refugees International, where she focuses on the people who have been forced to flee their homes due to climate change. Her job there is as Senior Advocate and Program Director at the Climate Displacement Program. She's an expert on state policymaking and the enormous and very expensive task of adaptation to climate change. And finally, we have Mariko Peters, who is with the European External Action Service here in Brussels. She's now a senior peace and conflict advisor in the department dealing with conflict prevention and mediation support. Before joining the European Union, she's been active in the law, in green politics, and has worked in Afghanistan, the Balkans, and the Horn of Africa. So thank you all very much for being with us. As I said, we're on the record, and we're going to start with our first section, which is called Resources Competition and Livelihood Insecurity. And to kick off the discussion, we're going to start with Ulrich Eberle from Crisis Group and Chris Hodder from the UN Mission for Somalia. And I'm going to ask both of you the same question, which comes to those who, like me, are from outside the world of climate change. Is it all about droughts? Are they the main problem? And is it drought per se that is driving competition over land resources in the Sahel and in the Horn? Or are there other climate stresses that we should all be thinking about? And perhaps I can give the floor first to Ulrich, who can tell us how things look from his perspective.
Sure, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, droughts are certainly important. It is, however, important to acknowledge that the link between climate change and conflict is nonlinear. What we really witness in recent years across the Sahel and the Horn is that extreme weather situation and droughts and floods alike put a big distress on people's livelihood, and in some circumstances can lead to conflict. And I think trusting the most reliable weather forecasts and also trusting the last IPCC report, we see that the role of weather extremes becomes increasingly important. And that can be expressed in droughts, extreme heat waves, floods and storms alike.
Great. And Chris, can you tell us a little bit from your perspective, an initial reaction to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I won't have my video on just because I've got low bandwidth at the moment. So I hope you can hear me okay.
We hear you loud and clear. Carry on.
Great. So I agree with Ulrich, and I think we all agree that there's no linear connection between conflict and climate change. However, we are seeing that there are four rough pathways to conflict, this link between climate and conflict. And as you said, drought is definitely one of them, but there are quite a few others as well. And some of the things we're trying to explore at the moment as well. So the first pathway is really this sort of livelihood aspect. And that's what, we're talking about. And this is where the sort of drought aspect comes inside. And we have, in Somalia, for example, we're definitely seeing drought as one of the driving causes, or one of the underlying causes, because there's a competition over water. But we're also seeing displacement, climate displacement due to flooding. We're also seeing displacement and competition over grazing lands. We're also seeing competition and fighting over, fishing rights on the ocean sides. So actually there's a multifaceted part of what causes or drives this link between climate and conflict. But as Ulrich said, it's not a linear aspect, it's multifaceted. Over.
Thanks, Chris. Ulrich, would you like to go down into some more detail about what you found in your research into Nigeria, for instance?
Yes, of course. Just 1 second, I would like to share my screen. All right, I hope you can see my screen well.
Looking good.
Very good. Great. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. I am Ulrich Eberle, Crisis Group's climate expert, and I'm very honored to open this session on resource competition and livelihood insecurity. Today, I would like to talk, as Hugh just pointed out, about Nigeria's farmer-herder conflicts. And I would like to present our piece that we published on last Earth Day together with a report on Nigeria's livestock national transformation plan that I will mention later on. To give you an idea of what farmer-herder conflicts are about, it is really an issue that is visible across the Sahel and the Horn. These are conflicts that are happening between farming and herding communities. And in many instances, there is an element of resource competition. And as we can see here, really there's a spatial concentration in these regions. And Nigeria is one of the countries that is mostly affected over the last 10 years. And as climate change is progressing, these conflicts increase in intensity and in frequency. In many respects in Nigeria, we have seen escalation of these conflict dynamics over the past decade. Before we talk about conflict dynamics, I'm going to zoom further in and slowly switch from the quantitative analysis to our on-the-ground analysis. But before doing so, I would like to underline that this piece is really an effort that stands on Crisis Group's work on this topic that is ongoing since many years. We have wonderful work on Nigeria's farmer-herder violence. I also have a research paper. And really our ambition here was to integrate science into policy analysis to bridge the knowledge gap between science and policy. And when looking at our first climate variable here, we have temperature as of 1950. And just in the span of 60 years, we see an average increase of around 1 degree Celsius, which is outpacing the global average. Temperature is important. Temperature is important for heat waves and droughts alike. It is, however, not the only expression or manifestation of climate change. One key aspect that our analysis shows is about seasonal variability. That is sort of the spread between the driest part of the year compared to the most humid one. And in the Sahel, we have a clear relationship with our climate system. The variability, the spread between very dry and very and the rain season is rather large, as we can see, for example, here in Nigeria's north. But it's not only variability within years and across years, also just within a couple 100 kilometers, we have quite some variety in rainfall patterns. For example, in Nigeria's north, we measure an average of 700 millimeter rainfall a year. In the south, it's about 3 times as high. So the climate gradient here is extremely steep. And people have adjusted their lives to these conditions. So for example, herders are mobile and migrate seasonally to make use of pastures in the time when they are available. All right, so the heart of our analysis in this piece is based on a quantitative assessment that studies the relationship between land productivity and conflict dynamics. we specifically look at the role of land use, since farmers and herders both use land to generate their incomes. Here in green and blue, cropland used primarily by farmers, in yellow, grassland, and then in brown, land that is interchangeably used by farming and herding communities. And what our analysis really shows is that violence is most prevalent in those northern regions, as well as spread actually across the country, where we have this dual use of land between farming and herding. And what I think is really insightful here is that it's not just an issue that happens in one country, in one corner of the country, it is spread throughout the country. Also, I believe that this kind of analysis allows us to zoom in from satellite-based measures down to local context. Here we have data that is measured at 250-meter resolutions, which is immensely helpful for our analysis to guide our fieldwork, but it's also helpful for policymakers to understand which places are most exposed to climatic distress. All right, back to the conflict map. When looking across Nigeria's conflict events that are related to land resources, there isn't really one single story about farmer-herder violence. There's several things going on. So, for example, in the northeast of the country, the Lake Chad region, Boko Haram contributes to violence. In the northwest, it looks very different. In recent years, we see an emergence of issues over banditry. We have a report on that as well. And then in the Middle Belt region, here in the center of Nigeria, that is where you would find rather conventional, what I would call conventional issues over resource competition, issues over land. And, as demographic pressures increase and climatic pressures increase, and there's less resources for the same amount or growing amount of people, that can cause these clashes between the two groups. And I would like to focus on these states that are very central. There was a peak in violence, in farmer-herder violence in 2018 in these in the Middle Belt region. And I would like to specifically focus on the states, Benue State and Nasarawa. Benue State introduced in late 2017 a anti-grazing legislation that aimed at curbing trespassing and also aimed at, by that, curbing violence between farmers and herders. Introducing, or shortly after the introduction of this policy, herding communities have been displaced, and some of them went to Nasarawa State. Upon arrival in Nasarawa State, it didn't take long until a Fulani pastoralist and a Tif farmer clashed. There was this isolated, uncoordinated clash between those two people that led to a sequence of violence, a sequence of coordinated attacks, acts of retaliation that played out over the coming month. And in these conflicts, over 260 people died, and only the government, only the military could put an halt to violence, stopping and as further escalation, however, not resolving or not removing the root cause of these issues. Speaking about root causes, the Nigerian government introduced the National Livestock Transformation Plan. It is a 10-year plan that aims at modernizing the livestock sector. And one integral part of that policy is to introduce so-called grazing reserves. The idea is to change traditional cattle keeping from seasonal migration to putting herders into ranging reserves where they stay stationary and take care of their cattle. As we can see here, some of them are implemented where we have seen just before some violence. And when zooming out, taking a look across the country here in red, we see those pilot states that were part of this early introduction of these grazing reserves. As per publication in April of this piece, the take-up rate was still lagging behind, and we underline that it is important to get more commitment and these reserves implemented in order to make this policy a success. Please check out the report. There's a wonderful analysis and a lot of detail and all the recommendations. One that I would like to point out is the one that relates to climate change. When doing any of land-related, resource-related policies, we urge governments and everyone else to take climate science into account. And I think that is very much in line with where the climate security space is right now. From the UNSC draft resolution that asks for an integration of science into field analysis to governments, it is just helping you to get a better idea, make sure that these policies are still working in 10, 20 years down the road. All right, that's it from my side. Back to you, Hugh.
Thank you so much, Ulrich. It's always great to see that so well illustrated. And just in case anybody's wondering where else you can see it, you can see in the chat, you will find the links to the original of that Scrolly. So Chris, that's the story from West Africa. Can you compare and contrast a bit in Somalia? Are you seeing the same kinds of resource competition? Is there any adjustment being made? Where does climate stress fit into the overall picture of conflict there?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. And just to reiterate, yeah, so I'm Chris Hodder. I'm the sort of first climate security advisor to a peacekeeping mission. So I'm a bit of a guinea pig trying to figure out how to actually move all of the sort of practice in theory into practice, and what do you do about climate security. So I can sort of give a bit of an update, but I think that the links that Ulrich was saying around the competition over the livelihoods and specifically on the sort of herder communities, I think we can definitely see that in Somalia. 70%, I think something 72% of the GDP is based on livestock, and so the camel movement across the country and the trade routes that were there since a long time, they're being disrupted by these sort of climatic changes. And so we're really seeing, as Ulrich is seeing, and I think it's across the board, this sort of changes in access to livelihoods. And I spoke a bit earlier about these sort of four sort of pathways between climate and conflict, and sort of first pathway is this sort of livelihood one. And direct answer to your question, yes, droughts is one of them, and we're about to face possibly 3.2 million people in a very severe IPC3 level food insecure level by the end of this year or early next year. So it could be a drought similar to 2017. And so that drought level, driven by climate change, but also because of deforestation and the charcoal trade, which the UN and the government have been quite successful in reducing. There's still a big dependency on charcoal and desertification, which is then causing soil erosion, which is then causing also contributing to the droughts. But further on the livelihoods one, there's also the flooding side. So last year alone, we saw 75% of new displacements in Somalia due to flooding and droughts, and flooding was a major cause of that. So the flooding along the riverine areas is causing massive displacement. So riverine areas where there are the breadbasket of countries are really seeing the impacts of raising precipitation, increases in river levels, but also seeing, that's where a lot of the agricultural lands were. And Somalia used to be a net exporter in the 1990s of food, but now it's a net importer of food. So really seeing the impact of climate change on agricultural lands as well due to flooding. And then also grazing lands, and something like a large part of, we don't know the correct details, but something like 70 or 80% of the conflicts in Somalia have some aspect of grazing land or access to water as part of some of the underlying parts of the conflict. So really trying to see that as a key part of this. And the last one is that we often talk about climate security on the terrestrial side, but there is actually also climate security on the ocean and the coastal areas. And so rising in ocean levels, changes in fishing patterns, that's all leading to actually bringing communities into conflict with each other. So in Somalia, we're seeing conflict between traditional fishermen and legal fishing vessels as well. So those changing patterns lead a lot. The second sort of pathway I wanted to talk about was a bit around migration and displacement, and so how actually a lot of these competitions are actually leading to populations being displaced. And so, as I said, we've got something like 3 million people displaced in Somalia, 2.7 million people displaced, with more happening every year. And the frequency, as we can see, as I was saying before, of drought and flooding we can see that actually getting more and more every year. And that displacement of population moving from one place to the other is actually causing quite a lot of conflict between communities as well, and also specifically in a place where clan dynamics is so strong that moving of populations and intertwining is actually causing a lot of that side of things. But the question is are we calling it migration, or are we calling it urbanization? Because a lot of the cases, communities are going to urban environments because they can't go back, because a lot of the land is completely degraded. And the projections in Somalia are that we'll be, by 2080, we'll be anywhere between a 3 and a 4 degree rise, which means huge parts of Somalia will be uninhabited. So it will be, the communities can't go back. And actually that then creates this whole issue around international migration and movement of population, which can be seen as a security risk globally as well. The sort of third one is, and the fourth one, these pathways around militant groups and elite capture are really interesting ones that we're trying to look at in Somalia. And so the idea of how militant groups are not only gaining from climate change, because the reduction in livelihoods means that there is easy picking, specifically amongst youth, of recruitment into militant groups. And so that's a really interesting area that we're trying to look at. But we're also looking at how militant groups are benefiting in terms of resource taxation. So the charcoal trade, the sugar trades, the export of charcoal. And we're also seeing things like how militant groups are bombing water wells or using water points as a control mechanism. We've also seen militant groups breaking riverbanks to gain taxation of communities that need protection money. So they're breaking the riverbanks to store the irrigation canals to stop those communities getting water that they don't pay. So there's a really interesting dynamic there around militant groups and stuff. And the last one is really this elite capture point, and how elite groups and this whole issue of corruption. And we can see in Somalia, for example, the issues of illegal fishing, and also other parts of the corruption systems that have benefited certain people. And so trying to see how we can work with governments on the transparency aspect around that. So just briefly, what are we doing about it in the sort of UN in Somalia? We're doing a lot of work around trialing some works on environmental mediation. We're looking a lot of work around, can we build a rule of law institutions around corruption, but also in terms of environmental protection? Can we look at conflict analysis and bring in the climate lens? So we really look at integrated analysis of conflict from that climate perspective. But we're also doing things like, adaptation at the community level. Can we build nature-based solutions into this? Can we divert some of the humanitarian funding every year? $1 billion goes into Somalia each year on humanitarian aid. Can we take just a part of that to look at ecosystem redevelopment and restoration that could then, in the long run, reduce some of that impact to the drought and some of that competition? So there's a whole load of stuff we're trying to do, and the government itself is doing a great job at trying to bring those central parts into the planning. So.
Ulrich, looks like we've either lost you or you've done. Maybe I can turn to Ulrich quickly. Just you've given the West African perspective. Chris has given it from Somalia. Are these very extreme, or do you think there are many other places in the world that similar stories could be told? Ulrich.
Yeah, so there is a lot of focus right now on Africa, the Sahel and the Horn specifically, for reasons, as Chris just pointed out, because a lot of the issues are very visible there. Climatic distress and climate security issues are not limited to Africa, though. If you think about one issue that we observe in parts of the Sahel, prolonged dry seasons followed by erratic and extreme rainfall, that is also a pattern we observe causing distress in the dry corridor, for example. Then, as you mentioned earlier, Hugh, the Middle East suffers from a different climate stress factor, however, also introduces livelihood insecurity there, issues over water quantity and quality governed or paired with poor governance can cause issues and has to some respect also contributed to protests there. So it is really a global issue. Climate change is also an issue of the global north. Most of the issues that we observe leading to violence today are really spread across the global south, though. That is also, Latin America, Central America, the Middle East, Africa, of course, and Southeast Asia as well.
Thanks, Ulrich. And Chris, you've told us you're the first ever climate advisor to a peacekeeping mission. What lessons are you learning in Somalia that could be applicable to other areas of the globe that we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, like for example, these part of it is mainstreaming and the importance of mainstreaming climate and environment into humanitarian development and peace approaches. And so I think there's a really strong case for having an integrated, nexus approach to what we're trying to do. So in Somalia, for example, we've really brought climate security into the rule of law institutions, done trainings and support to politicians as well as maritime, military and police strategies. So it's still early days, but what we're seeing is, for example, on the environmental mediation approach, we think that hopefully it's going to lead to a much more stable approach to stabilization. But the idea is that if we can bring really true integrated approach with an ecosystems thinking approach rather than just drilling wells and providing short-term solutions, that we really try to bring that as a holistic approach. So I think the early signs are that that's quite an exciting findings.
That's great news to hear, and thanks very much, Ulrich and Chris, for that first part of our panel today. The second part is now starting. We're going to talk something about something that Chris and Ulrich have both raised, the question of displacement of people, and perhaps when does displacement become migration. The World Bank is currently predicting that there will be 220 million total internal migrants in 30 years' time, and already apparently there are 10.3 million people have been displaced internally in the last 6 months. This is a huge problem, and to discuss this we're going to have two parts. The first, we're going to have Ulrich and Alan Boswell talking about the specific areas of interest, and then we are also very lucky to have with us Kaylee Ober, who will come in a bit later to talk about the big picture of policy on displacement. So Ulrich, you're still with us, and Alan Boswell, our South Sudan expert from Crisis Group. Climatic distress is obviously one source only of displacement. You've mentioned other classical insurgency type things that are pushing people out of their homes. But can you put it all a bit in perspective? How important is climate within all the different factors that are pushing people away from their birthplaces? And perhaps Ulrich, if you could go first, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we have a piece we're working on right now that I will present in a minute together with Alan that focuses on displacement and how displacement contributed in South Sudan to violence as well. In South Sudan, many things are going on. There are different drivers of insecurity and different drivers of displacement, such as food insecurity, conflict, and more recently also floods in a more direct manner. In many respects, these different factors are intertwined and aggravating each other. And, it is just another factor in an equation that, puts more pressure on local communities, forcing them away from their homes. Alan, would you like to add something?
No, that's good. If we want to go ahead to the South Sudan bit.
Yeah, go ahead. Tell us about the conflict dynamics that you're seeing in South Sudan.
Ulrich, do you want to go with your presentation to start off?
Yeah, sure. All right. Yeah, my intervention will be very short. I hope you can see my slides. The Future of Conflict and the Horn team at Crisis Group started working on displacement in South Sudan, as I already mentioned. And it is really, I think, a wonderful work and very excited about this collaboration with Alan. I would like to provide you the big picture on the flood impact over the last years. Really, the last 2 years, especially here starting in January 2020, where the 2020 mark is, and also right now, in fact, the floods had a big impact on South Sudan, displacing over 500,000 people and contributing to widespread insecurity and also to violence in Equatoria and South Sudan's south. So the 2020 floods and also this year's floods seem to be very big in magnitude, unprecedented in recent history. And to give you an idea where these floods are most prevalent, here the data unfortunately stops in the summer, so we don't have the current floods here. Satellite measures are always a little bit delayed, so apologies for that. But I think it still gives us an idea of, the regions that are most affected. In blue, you see the extent of floods. The darker the blue, the more the impact along the duration of floods. And, looking at just the last 2 years, I think it's very much in line with climate forecasts that predict for the Horn, and we already see that there is an increase in water supply on average per year. That means there's more water, and a lot of that is distributed in extreme ways. And, it is likely that the floods we have seen in 2020 and 2021 become more normal in the future as climate change is progressing. And, in terms of displacement, we have data here from REACH. Obviously, it's difficult to collect that kind of data, but we try to merge satellite-based measures with on-the-ground data points. So there's certainly a bunch of points missing, but I think we get the big picture right. There's several clusters that are close to these places where we had the floods. And as already mentioned, these floods have displaced a large amount of people. Some of them were herders, and some of them went to the south, contributing to instability upon their arrival. And to kind of finish my part with a quote from one of our interviews, snakes and people were competing for higher ground. I think that is speaks more than any map I could show you to describe the dire situation that we have right now in South Sudan. All right, over to you, Alan.
Cool, thanks everyone. There we go, okay. Yeah, thanks, Ulrich. So yeah, I mean, I think it's worth at least starting stressing, as Ulrich has done, just how massive and catastrophic these floods in South Sudan have been for now 2 years running, and really the compounding nature of these two floods back to back. There was also, I mean, in some ways it's the third year of consecutive flooding, but the last two have been a very significant. And I think it's over 700,000 people, which is quite a high percentage of South Sudan's population that's been affected by these floods. And you've had entire areas and communities who have essentially been displaced. One thing that we have done here is we have tried to create a little microcosm and track specific herding families who have been displaced, primarily in the Jonglei area, specifically in the Tweech area from last year's floods, and then track them into the southern region of South Sudan, which is the Equatoria region. And this is the area that still has a remaining insurgency in South Sudan after the peace deal in 2018. And it's been interesting because we have herders who left because of the floods, who say that's the reason they fled, despite insecurity and other reasons. They were specifically displaced by the floods, and they end up in Equatoria with hostile communities, oftentimes, and with rebel groups who view them as basically a hostile force also, and then who end up in violent conflict. So it's a pretty direct link in some ways between a climactic event, displacement, leading to armed violence, tracking all the way through. The challenge, which goes to the complexity of all this, is that this conflict did not start with the arrival of these specific herders. They just ended up getting sucked into these existing conflict dynamics, and in some ways exacerbating the conflict dynamics that already exist. I'll try not to go into the whole conflict dynamics. We've written about it in Crisis Group, but essentially you've had, going back more than half a century, you have migrations from the from the ethnic Dinka, from the greater Boer area in Zhonglai State into this Equatoria region, which is a mix of pastoralists and farmers themselves. This is for a bunch of reasons, including flooding going way back, but it's also become highly politicized in South Sudan. The current president in South Sudan is a Dinka, and the rebel forces in the Equatorial region are opposition forces fighting against the government. So the fact that it is basically co-ethnics of the president who are coming in with their guns as pastoralists without really asking permission, often from the host communities, that of course, in some ways has exacerbated the conflict that already exists.
Thanks, Alan. Is there anything that you would like to say about how far you think the climate really fits into your classical crisis group style analysis of dynamics? How is that helping you see new ways towards conflict resolution and the sources of conflict?
You know, it's interesting because the like we said, we wrote about this conflict already actually very recently. And in many ways, the climactic aspect wasn't a major factor because there are these massive political factors. The rebellion in the Equatoria region really, I mean, it started coming about after the Civil War happened in 2013, but the historical roots of that go back to the 1970s, the 1980s. And as it always does in South Sudan, just keeps going further and further back. But then in 2017, you had this rebellion happen. And then in the middle of this, one of the grievances, which include a grievance over, how much power they have at the national stage, the share of resources they get. There's a lot of demands for decentralization and federalism from these groups. But one of the demands has been complaints of herders into their land, usually well armed. It also happens that most of the army has been dominated by the Dinka ethnic group, and at least now after the army fell apart during the Civil War. And from our conversations with herders and with host communities, it's often the army, in the absence of credible state institutions, is often the army who's asked to mediate between the herders and the farmers, for instance. So you can see how that would not feel like a very fair situation for the host community often. So I think it's also an interesting case because often, usually it's the pastoralists who are who don't have much power in a lot of the countries across the Sahel. And South Sudan's a case where that's actually sort of flipped on its head and it's created its own dynamics. And I think even the notion of even the notion of whether or not this is climate induced or whether or not it's opportunism is something that the host community, for instance, would find itself a political narrative. So I think as the sort of consciousness that climate is changing and that it's affecting displacement comes about, I think we'll see that whole narrative itself become politicized as well. But I think the key question for us is there's a lot of the talk, I think, in the climate security space there's now that deals a lot with local peace building, intercommunal sort of talks, which is what's interesting in this case is we have a national peace process that has broken down at the national level. There's a ceasefire that's been repeatedly broken, and this influx has sort of overlapped with that and exacerbated those conflicts. But you haven't seen much introduction of the impact of the climate and how that's impacting the conflict dynamics on the ground into that sort of national peace process. So I think we're seeing, a sort of bifurcation between sort of local peace building processes and then the national peace processes, and finding a way to bring those two together. I think is going to be one of and exactly how to do it is going to be one of the core challenges moving ahead.
Thank you, Alan. That's a great insight into the local politics of South Sudan. And thanks, Ulrich, for giving us a taste of the data. Let's step back a bit and look at the big picture. We are very lucky to have Kaylee Ober with us, who's got a lot of experience in advising governments on how to deal with displacement, how to define displacement. I'm also very interested to find out what the difference between forced displacement and migration might be. And we're also joined for this section by Chris Hodder, who's also can give us a look from Somalia as well, perhaps. But first to you, Kaylee, what's the best way, do you think, to frame this whole idea of displacement and how to make people react to it in a way that's not going to be a reaction of fear of migrants and more fear of stoking up climate change, which may be ultimately be the more important driver?
Thanks for the question, Hugh. So from my point of view, what I always say is climate change is rarely ever the sole driving force behind displacement or migration. And I think Ulrich, Chris, Alan just illustrated that very well, which is that the ways in which climate change really induces displacement is quite varied. And there's actually larger, more systemic drivers that exist already before climate change may exacerbate existing drivers, right? So I think classically you can see displacement and migration as parts of a broad spectrum of human mobility. Traditionally we see displacement as something that is much more sudden. You have a lot less agency in the way in which you move. Migration is a longer term process, usually over longer distances, sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced. And so I'll be using kind of these sorts of definitions as we move forward in this discussion, just as a background. When we talk about displacement and climate change, there's some very interesting or relevant sources of information to look at, like the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which really illustrates that displacement risk is a function of the type of hazard at hand. How sudden or intense is it? Existing vulnerabilities, the ability to mobilize social resources or economic resources to move, and the capacity to overcome these shocks, right? So I think that by and large, climate change just filters through these different things in different ways. Likewise, I encourage people to look at the UK government's foresight report, which really shows that migration decisions are quite complex and context specific, and that different drivers like the political or the economic or the social are really often those driving factors behind migration decisions, and climate change just filters through these in different ways and exacerbates these underlying drivers or vulnerabilities. And so I think that should be the starting place, right? We're fundamentally talking about issues of governance. So the systemic inequalities that may exist within different sorts of contexts, and the ability to overcome these sorts of inequalities in the face of changing climate impacts when it comes to the outcomes of migration or displacement in particular. So that's the starting place.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. Chris, you're still on the line, I hope. Is there anything that you have to add on the whole migration displacement question and policy making towards it?
No, I mean, I think Kaylee did it very well, and I think it's very, it's very interesting exactly what Kaylee was saying. I'm just going to share in the chat a report that IOM and UNEP did on climate migration or climate displacement and the maladaptation techniques of a lot of climate displaced. And actually, it shows the difference between climate displaced populations and conflict displaced populations. And it's really interesting, the findings that often climate displaced populations, they're often displaced multiple times, or they are impacted, and then it's a real sort of downward trend, and actually they leave often in the last moment with nothing. Whereas conflict displacement, often you leave with, often you can leave with your livelihoods, and you can often come back as well. But what we find is that climate displacement is often really, your resilience is at a real low, and it's just really interesting how the findings of this show that also climate displaced populations, their maladaptation techniques are often around, they need charcoal for use, so they have to cut down trees. So wherever you go, you cut down trees. Often you then have to displace again because of the soil erosion, the flooding, and so actually this cycle is a real thing that we have to look into and try to break.
Kaylee, from the government perspective that you've focused on so much, what kind of policy advice do you give to them to try and actually intervene in what seem to be very local events?
Yeah, I think based on this discussion, as you can see, it's quite complex, right? So the interventions must be multifaceted. In a recent report we put together through RI, through an expert task force on climate change and migration, to heed the call for the Biden administration's report on climate change and migration, we can see that this issue is gaining traction or interest from different sorts of governments, including the Biden administration, right? And we wanted to ensure that The Biden administration and others really look at this from this multifaceted point of view. And we found there's two big buckets of policy work to be done. One around prevention, or allowing people to stay in place if they would like to do so, right? So that's through things like investments in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. That's through targeting those who need the most support when it comes to development in general, not just through climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. We also find that a second bucket of work is hugely useful to think about, which is protection and pathways. So this is acknowledging the reality that even with our best efforts to intervene and prevent migration or displacement, there still will be people migrating, right? And to acknowledge that reality and put together policy solutions that are quite novel, including offering different forms of protection or pathways to the United States or other countries that facilitate kind of safer and more dignified movement, right? So I think we can see that what's needed is multifaceted and complex, but it hinges on both preventing as much as possible and facilitating migration where it's necessary as much as possible to ensure human security and sustainable futures are met as much as possible.
Alan, Kaylee's hinted at how difficult it is in emergencies to plan, but she has nevertheless given several very neat ways of looking at it from a policy perspective. You've spent hours, days, perhaps even weeks agonizing over recommendations to governments for crisis group reports. What would work in a country like South Sudan in terms of real concrete policy making that can head off some of these migration displacement risks?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I mean, obviously, preventing and mitigation is something that is going to receive a lot of focus. For instance, on the floods in South Sudan, to try to just prevent them to begin with. But then I think it's something that will end up going up on several levels. We'll see a lot of sort of efforts on trying to create awareness. I think a lot of sensitization for communities in terms of climate displacement, especially the host communities, and trying to sort of ease those negotiated access, so to speak. But I think something else that's going to be really important is just always remembering how deeply political these dynamics can get, especially when they sort of fall into existing conflict dynamics like we've seen, and then essentially not forgetting that so we don't separate, like I said, sort of local peace building from the national peace processes, and find a way to make sure those stay connected.
Thanks, Alan. Chris, can I turn to you? You're the first climate advisor to this UN mission. How easy is it to get people to absorb the advice you're giving to them? I mean, is it completely new to them, or are they saying, at last, I've been thinking this for years. Thank goodness you've come up with an idea to deal with it?
And it's a fascinating question, and it really is. It depends on who you speak to. So there's certain parts of the mission that have been very receptive. I think overall it's been very receptive, and even the government itself on the sort of policy advice that we're trying to do, and exactly like Kaylee was setting out some of the recommendations that we did from that report. There's a lot of buy-in on this, but I think it's interesting. I feel like in the sort of more development humanitarian sphere, there's much more buy-in and interest and thinking, and already starting to think about what do we do. And I think with the international media on it, there's a lot going on. I think on the harder security side, it's been a bit harder. But again, it very much depends on whether you've got some forward thinking, different people within the mission, or whether they're a bit more sort of traditional thinking. And so, for example, we need to change, for example, the UN base across to a solar panel system. So trying to think about mini grids around the base, and how do we move that? But there's obviously then that harder security side that thinking, well, hold on, we need to think about the security side. We need to think about mortar overhead. We need to think about, that we need to keep the backup, the generators, and so there's a whole system, and also an economic system within that that we have to be realistic of. So it's really around, it's like anything really. There are certain people that are supporters, and there are sort of people that are less supportive. But I think generally it's been relatively good.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. This has been a really interesting look at how this all ties into itself. So we'll move on to the third climate change area that we're going to look at. And for everyone who's listening, you will get a chance to ask questions at the end. We definitely want you to hear what all the panelists have to say first. And in terms of that, we're going to move to part 3, which is looking at the strategic risk of climate change. And this fascinating idea that climate change is often called an actorless threat. And to discuss this, we've got, first of all, Rob Blecher from Crisis Group, who's running our Future of Conflict program, and who will be joined by Mariko Peters from the European External Action Service. So, Rob, if I can turn to you first and ask, we've just had COP26. One thing that definitely was not on the agenda directly was the question of conflict security, climate security, or the link to conflict. Where should the home of climate security be on the global political stage? Are there any costs for omitting it from the agendas of COP? And perhaps what are your thoughts about where it should be in the global lineup?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Certainly, there are costs to omitting it, and I think you could probably split up that question 2 ways, right? Like, what are the effects on the climate agenda if you don't include security concerns? And what are the effects on security if you don't look at climate concerns? And I think no matter which way you push it, or no matter which way you interpret it, there's going to be a problem. So, like, just looking at the first one first, if you have the in terms of the effects on the climate agenda, if you don't look at conflict and security, COP is actually a great example, right? Yes, COP was not on the official agenda. There were some side events that did tackle the issue of climate security, and those side events were trying to highlight the importance of the issue to try to pull it next year or sometime in the future back toward the center. I think the big issue here is that if you don't take into account conflict, it is going to be very hard for any climate agenda to realize its goals, right? So if you look at what was happening at COP26, climate adaptation was one of the headline issues. Obviously, the headline issue was emissions, but adaptation was also right up there. And when you think that half of the most climate change affected countries are also affected by conflict, you start to think, well, exactly how are we going to get these adaptation measures done on the ground on any kind of meaningful scale if we don't take account of the fact that people are fighting? There are people running around with guns. There are people who have invested political and economic interests in continuing the status quo. And if you can't deal with the conflict as part of your adaptation considerations, then it's very difficult to imagine how you're going to be able to move forward. So we've already talked a lot about specific instances in the last couple sessions, but I guess one where we haven't mentioned, I don't think, is Colombia. Crisis Group a couple of weeks ago came out with a report on deforestation in Colombia, right around the time of the COP declaration on forests and land, which talked about ending deforestation by 2030. But if you think about Colombia, there's a whole lot of deforestation right now, and that is being done by armed groups that took over territory after the FARC's unilateral ceasefire in 2014 and the peace deal in 2015. Armed groups that took over, sometimes working in collaboration with big corporations in kind of like a gray area, deforesting, pushing back the frontier, using it for livestock and coca and whether illicit, whether they're legal or illegal commodities is less interesting than sort of the illicit economy that this is operating within and the deforestation that's happening. How are you going to stop deforestation within a little over 8 years, unless you take account of the fact that there's people with guns and very entrenched interests that are in these places? We've heard about the loss of pastoral land. Earlier in what we talked about, Ulrich went on about talking about what was happening in Nigeria, right? Like and across the Sahel, how are you going to do adaptation unless you take account of the fact that there is herder farmer competition over what's happening with the land? So that's the first way to look at it. The second way to turn your question in the beginning is, what happens to a security agenda if you don't look at climate? And here, I guess I would talk a little bit about what's happening on the sub-state level, looking at non-state actors. Chris actually already mentioned a couple things about Somalia. Here it's quite important, but maybe even before looking at specific examples in specific countries, you can take a step back and say, well, if you look across the Horn, and not only the Horn, but certainly Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, maybe CAR, the cyclical weather each year has a lot to do with how people fight, right? Dry season with muddy roads advantage the government, which is engaging in conventional warfare, moving heavy weaponry, whereas during the rainy season, when the roads are more muddy, it's a lot harder to move those big weapons, and so it advantages the non-state actors who are engaging in asymmetric warfare. So you can imagine that as these cyclical patterns change over time, if it gets drier, if it gets wetter, that's going to have a balance. That's going to change the balance of whether it's symmetric warfare or asymmetric warfare that is advantaged or disadvantaged. And I don't want to say that one side is going to always be advantaged over the other, because as we heard up top, climate change is not a linear process. So at different times, different actors could be advantaged or disadvantaged, but it's something to keep in mind as we think about how these processes are going to unfold. A second factor is maybe thinking about where populations live, right? We heard a lot about climate refugees. I won't go into it again, but sort of always the mixing and unmixing of populations is always a dangerous thing, and potentially a dangerous thing. We heard about the South Sudan instance, but that is an instance where climate is playing into a civil war and insurgency in the South. Third area to think about in terms of non-state actors are about winning hearts and minds. If you think about the kind of drought and misery that's caused, the kind of misery that's caused by droughts and floods, it can be a propaganda windfall for non-state actors. So it's true of Al-Shabaab in Somalia. It was very true of ISIS. ISIS was very effective at exploiting this in Iraq. In the video we showed you up top, there was, I'm not sure it was labeled, like when the camera or the animation panned over to Mexico, there were pictures of care packages, boxes that are being given out that are dispensas or narco dispensas. They are care packages that are being given to victims of extreme climate events, and there was a picture on one of them of a cartel leader. Right? These are, whether you want to call them PR, hearts and minds, propaganda, regardless of the value judgment you put on it, these are ways that non-state actors are reaching out to local populations. And not only is it, I guess, PR value, sometimes it's also real government services. Like, in Somalia, it's true that Al-Shabaab has sometimes taken advantage of weather, geography, flooding to advance its own interests. It's also engaged in what could be called like rough governance projects of building up riverbanks or facilitating irrigation in order to help control climate change. So it's providing a service that the government's not able to provide. And then the final thing I would say here under non-state actors in climate change, and what happens if you don't take account of it, are the entry points that it opens up potentially for proxy war, right? So if you think about, for instance, the GERD in Ethiopia, over the last years, there's been a new guerrilla group that has appeared in the area that is attacking GERD, the dam, the infrastructure. A lot of people see Egypt's and Sudan's hand in that. There's not really proof of that, but a lot of people see Egypt's and Sudan's hand in it. And I think we can expect that as transboundary competition over water increases, we're going to see more and more opportunities for this kind of infiltration or sponsorship of proxies from outside. So you know, in all those kinds of ways, I think, you know, climate change opens up doors here for a different kind of security dynamic. And if we don't take it into account, we're going to be missing one important aspect of the climate equation, of the security.
Thanks so much, Rob. And how would you suggest that the powers that be deal with this? I mean, it's a very complex series of dynamics. You've got it's all very new for people. Is this something that needs to be a separate source of summitry, the whole issue of climate security? Can it be fed into all kinds of places? Should it be part of the UN? What way do you see that this new dynamic should be best regulated and interacted with by those who would wish to?
Well, it's easy to say mainstreaming and hard to do it. So I'll say mainstreaming, and I'll offer you know, just a couple thoughts on that. So I think we should not diminish the efforts that have been made so far. At COP, there were significant side events, and there have been lots of people in the climate security community urging the inclusion at COP27 and probably in Cairo for the next meeting. It's going to be, I think, a challenge to get it on the agenda for the same reason it has been a challenge to get it on the Security Council agenda, because there are significant countries, Russia, China, India, countries that prefer to see this as a development or environmental issue, because they fear that if you expand the definition of international security, it's going to touch on their sovereign prerogatives and potentially interfere with development. So I think it's going to be a hard lift, especially when there's so much attention to emissions and there needs to be cooperation on emissions. So to introduce contested questions of war and peace when you can barely get even minimal agreement on emissions, it's going to be very difficult. And also, so there's the COP piece. Also, there's the UN Security Council piece. As many people probably know, there is a resolution before the council now to have a general global approach to at least in terms of reporting on climate security. That the prospects do not look great right now. It's still possible that it moves through. But even as that resolution for the moment isn't moving, it is true that there is climate change as part of specific mandates and missions. And it's Chris is a pioneer who's the person who's pushing it through with the Somalia mission, and hopefully there will be more Chris's in the future. But there are other missions and mandates that climate change is included in somehow. And I think we need to, keep pushing on those. I guess for real specifics for people who are thinking about this for next year, COP27, if it cannot get on the official agenda for the reasons that we said, maybe there could be a high-level side event, a leader-level side event. There was not a leader-level side event this year. There could be a leader-level side event that is chaired by the host. That would be chaired by Egypt. That would bump up the status of it. That would be the first thing. And that would call more attention to it. We could try to push on the adaptation front to sort of try to get the delegates at COP itself to weave conflict through their conversations. If they just say conflict, but don't weave it into the adaptation and mitigation measures, that's not going to help either, right? So if you can broadcast it and then weave it through, that's the important thing. And at the Security Council, people are still working on it. Good luck to Ireland getting it through. Niger is also working. Germany wrote the initial draft. There's lots of countries that are pushing hard on this. And if you can't get the holistic resolution through, there's still the possibility to work on a per issue level. And so that's where the pressure will need to come until we can get a holistic resolution.
Chris, if I could bring you in quickly, I mean, how much would that help you to get a leader level side event proclaiming support for this mainstreaming effort?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the fact that the mandate in UNSOM is so strong on the environmental side allows me to actually implement a lot of work and actually then deliver a lot of the things specifically around climate risk management strategies, looking at specific climate vulnerabilities as well, and that really supports my work. So I think that a more strengthened one is key to allowing not only more positions like mine, but also helping them really implement some certain things through the peacekeeping lens. And as Robert was saying, it's really important to have climate lens within the conflict analysis. But equally, I think it's really also important when we're doing mitigation and adaptation to bring in that conflict lens as well.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris. And we're also very lucky to have another government practitioner with us, Mariko Peters of the European External Action Service, who's actually dealing with these issues every day. Mariko, can you tell us how is the EU dealing with climate change as a strategic risk? And is there a difference between the theory and practice? And how does it all work? Over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Hugh, and thank you very much, Crisis Group, for this opportunity, and thank you for the co-panelists. I'm learning a lot from your research and field observations. Before I try to respond to your question, I need to make one remark. The doorbell may ring, my kids, and I need to throw the key out of the window, and then I'm back in 3 seconds behind my computer, if that happens. So that being said, indeed, I sit in a very different place from the other speakers. The headquarters of a big multi-government institution, the EU, and I advise policymakers and program and project designers. And I found it so interesting what before Kaylee said, that ultimately a lot of the challenges that we're now looking at are about governance, that it's a governance issue. Governance, I think you were talking about governance in places where climate change hits the hardest. We're also talking about governance, which is I think what Robert also alluded to, governance in the places where the climate change is caused, and the governance inside the actors who can or believe they can do something about it. And I would belong to the latter category. How do you change that governance inside an actor like the EU if you want to live up to this challenge of climate-related security issues? You need a lot of governance transformation for it. If we want to live up to the challenge, but we also know at the same time that governance transformation takes a long time. I used to work for the World Bank for a while, and they calculated that, let's say in average circumstances, any governance transformation of some sorts for it to stick, it takes on average about 40 years, 40 years. So that's a bit worrisome, and we need to find the button to push for acceleration if we're taking this seriously. But definitely within the EU, the urgency of having to deal with climate change as a security risk has been evident for some time. It's considered not only an opportunity that we need to be preparing for, it's considered a certain situation, a certain future trends that we need to be ready for. But how does that realization get translated into the agendas and actions? Well, it started also on our side with all the political statements. After the UN Security Council put climate and security on its agenda in 2007 already, I think was the first time, the EU put it in the heart of its global strategy for foreign and security policy a few years ago, 2016. And since then, we've seen an avalanche of political declarations, statements of all kinds at the highest levels within the EU. We have the Green Deal, of course, of our current Commission and its climate adaptation strategy. We have a massive budget regulation of about 90 billion euros, which is our budget money for anything that has to do with adaptation and development cooperation. And it has earmarked 35%, which comes down to about 28 billion euros for climate adaptation. And we've just learned half of that has to be done in areas where there's conflict or fragility. And then we have numerous of council conclusions on climate and energy diplomacy, climate and defense, climate and water upcoming or just done. And our own high representative is calling climate change the largest threat to security in human history. So this has increased the EU's ambition and space for maneuver for external climate-related action tremendously. So the challenge is now how to translate this unprecedented investment in policy declarations into our actions. And in all honesty, this has only recently begun. It requires no less than a new way of working to live up to the challenge. I can share 4 steps that we've taken so far and a few observations. First of all, we're investing in getting a better understanding on the convergence between climate change, environmental degradation, and security. We have incorporated climate indicators in our early warning systems. We've adjusted our methodology for conflict analysis, which we do in a structured manner in all countries where there's conflict and where we have EU programming to take a better look at the link between climate and environment issues and the conflict dynamics. And we're pooling all our climate and security relevant data collection efforts from across the EU and try to bring it together into one climate security relevant system. Secondly, what we're looking at is upscaling first actions in the field that seem to be giving proof of concept that if you really program, design around sustainable peace building in a climate change affected situation, you can make a difference. And there are some first important experiences that we are learning from, not in the last place, also from what Chris was talking about in Somalia, but also some EU funded project or EU conducted activities in Nepal, in Sudan, South Sudan, Tanzania, and some Latin American countries. But to be honest, this is still small beer. And we need to learn not only how to upscale, but there the word is again, how to mainstream this into our regular programs and policies and make this way of trying to target both peace building and climate in a structural manner at the same time. Massive challenges there for how to do the mainstreaming. First one is how do you cross the silos? We're learning and we're also being told by everybody who's a think tank on this topic. We need to bridge the silos. You have the peace community and the security people, you have the climate and environment people, and they're not used to talking together, working together. Yes, we come together in seminars like these, but the regular programming people, the people who do the hard work in the delegations or the people who run the missions, they already were doing human rights, they were doing gender issues, they were doing security sector reform. And now all of a sudden to take this whole mer à boire on climate data and climate dimensions and complex pathways on board, it's a different thing. So how do you cross those silos? And a second challenge that we're doing is that we are quickly learning that we need to expand our networks. Typically, we and our delegations will be talking to governmental counterparts in the capitals, whereas we're learning from these early field experiences that I just mentioned, that perhaps the solution to really make a difference in climate change and security is more in local peace deals, very, very local community arrangements and natural resource management. And also, again, it's very localized, specific contexts. But there you are in an area where perhaps a governmental actor like us, thinking in large numbers, large programs, doesn't have the best access, doesn't have the best networks yet. And also sometimes the counterparts for the networks that we would like to have are not there yet. We recently finished a pilot for a climate and conflict analysis, like trying to really integrate a climate look into our regular conflict analytical work. And there we had to just come to the very sobering conclusion that there was no government counterpart for even all the, once we had thought up all our beautiful recommendations with how to do something about it, who to start talking to and get to know them or contribute to that they come into being. Thirdly, we have started and need to do more of it, invest in the skills of our staff. We must learn how to make better use of all these beautiful climate environment data that institutions like yourself, Crisis Group, are producing, but alongside you, an increasing number of others. Thanks also to new technologies, satellite images, artificial intelligence, social data mining, some are even already using. And let's say your average diplomat doesn't yet know how to read those data, let alone how to translate them and then repackage them in bits and pieces for policymakers and program designers and diplomats who have big agendas in their regular dialogues and need to squeeze in a few seconds on the need to also look at climate change and environmental degradation. And this translation still requires a lot of investment in our skills. Fourth and last, we need to start taking much more account next to how we're now talking about climate change and security, we need to start to take much more account of the effects of the green transition, which is going to cause a whole set of new types of climate, of security dynamics and challenges of its own. The policies to address the climate crisis through emission reduction and energy transition can have its own massive geopolitical effects as they upend traditional economic and political relationships. So lastly, perhaps two observations. A concrete step on our end that has hugely expanded our operational, let's say, space to do things that we want to do is the recent adoption of a EU concept for an integrated approach on climate change and security. And later I'll put a link to the document in the chat. And it's basically our operational framework for how to integrate the climate and security dimension in all our relevant policies, from humanitarian aid to the design of security missions to our development cooperation along the entire conflict cycle. And then secondly, we have a new concept or guidelines on mediation, how to support dialogue and peace building through mediation, and that also centers on aspects of climate change and environmental degradation. And very lastly, I'd like to say that a key avenue in how we'd like to go forward is in partnerships. This we cannot do alone, so we largely depend on how far we can get in our already existing partnerships with think tanks, civil society, governmental organizations, African Union, OSCE, NATO, and so forth, but also very much importantly, data partnerships. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marika. That was really clear and a really great presentation. I just wondered, I didn't realize that the EU put quite so much money behind climate issues, like 90 billion euros, 28 billion for adaptation. The keys are going to go out of the window. Okay, it's while we're waiting for it to come back.
Alexander, joehoe! Hier, de sleutel. Ik ben in gesprek.
And Marika will be back.
Sorry, I forgot to mute.
That's okay. We've got you. We're glad to have you back. The EU is such a big actor. You've talked about partnerships, but do you find people imitating you? Is there some sort of normative process going on that as the EU pays more attention to things, you're seeing it reflected more around the world, or is the EU alone, or where does the EU fit in as a global actor on this?
That's such a challenging question. And before you know it, what happens to you in Brussels is that you're navel staring and completely absorbed by your own institutional environment. No, we very much need to do this in partnership with others. I'm looking with a bit of jealousy at the position that Chris already has. Wouldn't we also wish to have our own climate and environment advisors in all our CSDP missions? The first 3 are about to start, I have to admit, but wouldn't we also very much like to have it for our delegations? Why only in our security missions? It should also be for all the people who have to do the adaptation and development cooperation and humanitarian work. This is an invitation for people who can do advocacy to help make that happen. We're working closely with the OSCE, who have also actually following the UN Security Council agenda, also managed to put climate and environment and peace building on its agenda. So we work together with them in the let's say the Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus and Central Asia bits of the world. And with the African Union also, on the last visit of the commissioner who deals with peace to Brussels, climate change also figured as one of the key areas where they are eager to also, going forward, increase the collaboration with the EU. So yeah, I wouldn't dare say we're leading. I do dare say that we have momentum as an EU now, which is unprecedented, because we're about to start spending that insane amount of money. And we better find a way to do it in a climate sensitive, conflict sensitive way.
And just one more question to you, Marika, while we have you. This is incredibly complex. How do you deal with non-state actors? And how do you get down to the nitty-gritty of this sort of basically what is, as we've heard, local competition for resources, displacement on a very local scale, and it must seem a long way from Brussels. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I was a bit afraid of this question because indeed it's so complex. But we've been experimenting a bit like how Chris Hodder was explaining his work in Somalia with this pathways concept, which was developed, I think, by a Swedish think tank, and which various actors have now tried to apply in the field. We equally tried to do it in Sudan and South Sudan. So I've listened with great interest into your own research outcomes in South Sudan. So we've tried to apply this pathways that looks into this complex interlinkages between climate change and livelihoods, migration, non-state actors, elite behavior in the South Sudanese context. And the first results are just as complex as the methodology is and all the data that fed the work. And it's now very much up to our delegation to take it forward, but I can give you some examples for what comes out of such an analytical exercise. It's what comes out of it is a increased awareness that we need to have not nationwide solutions, but very localized solutions. You cannot apply a similar and the same solution to this square 50 kilometers and the next square of 50 kilometers almost. And at the same time, next to the localized approach, you need also a regional approach, a cross-national approach, because what happens, for instance, perhaps to another country, to the forests in the Central African Republic, might affect the water levels in the Blue Nile that fill up that water reservoir of the Gerd Dam. And I'm not sure if we have been looking at the right issue, all this focus on the security issues around that dam, while at the same time that river may very soon have much less water if we don't do something about the forest at another place of the continent. But at the same time, what we also need to do is here again, expand the networks, start talking to those government actors who have some type of control over what happens to natural resource management, water management, and some of them are not even there. We need to do awareness raising. How can we use our ongoing dialogues to also start discussing climate and environment and water? We need to find the link between what all this new analytical awareness can do to our regular programming. For instance, in South Sudan, we were used to do a lot in support of livestock and food security. Now, what does it mean if we have a better understanding of the very local conflicts here, there, or displacements, or whatever happened because of all these pathways and climate change and conflicts to our food security program? These types of questions we are trying to answer as we speak.
Thank you very much, Mariko. We've come to the end of our first three sections, and I'm very much looking forward to having some questions coming in from many listeners. There's a lot of people there. I can see that several have been answered already by the panelists typing into the chat box. But there's one that Ulrich has offered to answer live, so I'm going to go to that. But while I read it out, everyone else who'd like to ask questions, please go ahead and write them in. This question is from Han van Dijk, and he's worried that we're talking about the farmer-herder conflicts in a very decontextualized way. That there's so much more going on: deeper economic and political crisis, root causes, marginalization. Takeover of livestock ownership by urban owners, the lack of land use planning, and that these are the issues that we need to these are the issues we need to dig deeper into, and that perhaps we're overestimating the impact of climate. And Ulrich, perhaps I can ask you that question, and first at least.
Sorry, I'm still reading the question. If somebody else wants to jump in first.
This is about the whether, Ulrich, it's about the decontextualization of the herder-farmer conflict. There are so many other problems that cause these conflicts. Are we exaggerating by looking at climate? It's from
All right.
Han
Yeah.
van Dijk.
Okay, I got it. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I think one big part of our work is to understand the relative importance of climatic distress on conflict dynamics. And absolutely, there is no reason to overstate the issue. There are usually multiple factors that we have heard throughout this conversation today. Climate change is one that usually aggravates situations, but there are already political and socioeconomic tensions that play important parts to these conflict dynamics. So there's no, we should not overstate the role of climatic distress, but it also becomes visible that, the direct impacts that we observe in parts of the Sahel and the Horn matter as well. But obviously, I think the balance matters that, we acknowledge it in the appropriate manner. And that also helps with designing solutions to these issues.
Marika, maybe
Hugh, if I could just add one thing to Ulrich's answer. I also thought that question was quite important. And it is true in general that when certain issues become, the issue du jour of the analytic community, that a lot of analytic attention gets focused on that, and that might highlight it in a way which can feel excessive. But I think it's important to emphasize here that the fact that one has a contextual analysis doesn't mean that you can't be precise about it also, right? So what I mean by that is, yes, in all of these cases that we're talking about, there are many, many factors. Nigeria one, many factors, Somalia, many factors. In fact, every one of these is going to have many factors. But I think what we're trying to do at Crisis Group is we're trying to be as precise as possible about the role that climate is playing, which doesn't necessarily mean ranking any of these risks, because I think it would be quite hard to sort of like figure out, how each one in particular is more or less important. But through the ever increasing precision of the climate science, I think we're able to look more and more specifically at places to see what is happening and to be able to incorporate that precision into our analysis and into what I think many of you know is traditionally a different kind of analysis that Crisis Group has done, the more field-based interview qualitative as opposed to the quantitative. So fully agree on the contextual, but I also think we need to emphasize the precision.
And Marika, I also wanted to interested to hear what you had to say about that, since you're putting out an enormous amount of money. Well, does that simply create interest in things that shouldn't otherwise be there? How do you keep things in proportion?
How do we keep things in proportion?
But in the sense that we have a question here: are you not exaggerating the herder-farmer violence being? Well, of course, we're not saying it's solely due to climate change, but are you not exaggerating the climate factor? Is it what I'm trying to ask, I think, is this a European concern that is being somehow, because everyone is very worried about the climate in Europe, they're transferring that worry to Africa, whereas Africa, in fact, they have other concerns?
Very interesting question. In a way, it's so theoretical because, let's say, the train has already departed. We have already earmarked 35% of our development cooperation in not only Africa, but also Asia, Latin America, and the east of Europe for this purpose, because it is our firm belief that the future will be shaped not only by the need to deal with the planet in a new way and our energy consumption and energy production, but that it has a huge impact on climate. And then we're not talking about how to have exclusive climate adaptation projects. We're talking about how we can do climate adaptation as these countries will increasingly feel the impact of climate change in a conflict sensitive way if we do it in a conflict environment. And as we know, half of climate change is already hitting hardest in conflict affected countries, where the people are the most vulnerable, and where above all the actors may not be the largest emitters. So it's a mix of being trying to be responsible, but also trying to be realistic. It's simply where the data are teaching us the consequences are the most dire, and where the capacity to do something about it might not be in national hands.
Thanks, Mariko. We have a question I think is best answered by Chris from an anonymous attendee who's talking about the discrepancy between an enormous amount of analytical work on climate security, but there's a deficit of work on the programmatic side. And how can these be integrated, the anonymous attendee asks. And how can there be more people like Chris Hodder, is how he specifically says it. Chris, would you like to try and self-multiply yourself or show the way?
I'll try to, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I'd love to have more people like me, and I think that it's really important to, obviously. No, I mean, I think that my understanding is that there is already a response by different countries, like Mariko was saying. They're supporting a lot of programming. I think the Irish are actually supporting a position in Sudan or South Sudan, and I think that there's going to be a position in Mali. So I think that there are definitely positions being lined up. I think it's just a matter of time and sort of pushing that. But also, it also has to be a case of showing what we can deliver. And I think that, in answer to that question around the dearth of analysis and research around the link between climate and security, I definitely feel that there's a lot out there, and a lot of people are now, realizing and seeing those links, but there's very little around what do you actually do about it. And I guess it's a bit of a philosophical question, because if you think about climate security, then the result would be that the climate is then secure, but you can't do that. So it really has to be a multi-pronged approach from climate diplomacy. Countries have to reduce their carbon footprint. We all have to get to net zero. We have to focus on, we have to focus on peace building. We really have to focus on that sort of looking at protection of natural resources or regreening and looking at environmental restoration. But we also have to look at that sort of like community level. We're building that resilience, working with that, and then at the same time we have to build the systems within the governments to be able to return it. So it's really a sort of multi-faceted, we all have to do it together, and that's not an easy answer, because often you need money to be able to just do one specific thing, and actually this is a really complicated multi approach, but it has to be done that way.
Thanks, Chris. And we have a question from Alexandros Yiannopoulos, which I'd like to split into two. The first one, perhaps to Rob Blecher, about a new category. Do we need a new category? We have the less developed countries and island states in the past. Do you think that we should have a greater focus on fragile and conflict-affected states, where there is a greater interplay between conflict drivers and the exacerbating effects of climate change? Is that something that we need?
Yes. No. In all seriousness, like if that label, having a clear label, it makes it easier for people to think about things when there are clear labels. And if everybody could coalesce around a label like that, actually, I'm just sort of thinking out loud in juxtaposition to something like climate security. Climate security sort of comes out of a history. I'm sorry, I'm in New York, background noise is standard. There's a history of this term being used by national governments, like the government of the United States, as a term for something that threatens national security, and climate security is seen as something that needs to be confronted in order to maintain national interest, national security. If there was a label that did not, sort of have that freighted language, but sort of dealt with the kind of conflict dimension more, I think that would actually be a salubrious change. So yeah, I'm all for it.
So perhaps a crisis group list of such states, Rob Blecher, is going to be on your agenda for the new program. Another follow-on question on exactly that. How would you call this type of conflict that has an environmental lens or impact? Is it an environmental conflict? What would you call it? When we look at conflict, where we see conflicts that have been exacerbated by climatic factors. Is there a name for it?
I'm not sure if that's really to me or not, but I think sort of maybe one of the questions here is the relationship between climate and environment. And those aren't quite the same thing, right? There can be lots of kinds of environmental damage that are not necessarily related to climate, and you can, climate doesn't always, capture the same thing that environmental does. So I would say, it's, climate induced or climate exacerbated conflicts or what you're talking about.
Thank you. And the second part of Alexandros Yiannopoulos' question, I will also like to put to Alan, if you're still with us. Alan, he makes the point that that climate change factors are often dealt with separately from development factors. Do you think it's needed and practical to join them up better? Can you think of that? Can you see ways of that happening in South Sudan? Is it practical? Or does everyone need to stay in their own lane?
I mean, I think with the level of change that places like South Sudan are going to face and the level of challenge that they face from climate change, they need all of the above. I mean, South Sudan is a place that desperately needs development. It always needs humanitarian aid as well. And politically, it's very unstable as well. So I think the real challenge we were going to have when it comes to addressing this, the climate, besides just the amount of resources that will be required, I think the development in some ways might be more straightforward. I think some of the mitigation measures, if the resources are there, will be more straightforward. I do think more challenging will be that the political manifestations of it will be channeled into politics, and I think it might be challenging, as we find on many of these other drivers of conflict. It might be challenging to find technical solutions when even if they come from something like climate. I think oftentimes the way to resolve them are going to be through politics, local politics or national politics, and I think that in some ways it's when we go from the technical to the political that a lot of this is going to need to be get a lot more creative. So I think in some ways the development is something we might know how to do. We just might really struggle, I think, and they have really struggled, for instance, in South Sudan, to find ways to achieve development in a country that really hasn't managed to form a stable polity yet. So I think the degree to which the clock, that some of these really fragile states are sort of up against the clock. That's something that's really going to come to the fore as the planet heats up.
Thank you. We have an external question from Elena Raffato for Chris about how specifically is Al-Shabaab exploiting and benefiting from the illegal production and trade of charcoal, and can the EU and the international community do anything about it? Chris, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, historically, there has been an export of charcoal to Gulf states, but other countries as well that are using charcoal for smoking shisha. And so basically, what happened was the UN and the EU and the government put together a sanctions list and put some controls in place, and actually managed to stop a lot of that export in charcoal. And so that export in charcoal was actually quite a $1 million income generation stream for militant groups, including Al-Shabaab. Today, because export has actually managed to drop quite considerably, the manufacture of charcoal hasn't dropped a lot because of the rise in population and the need for 92% of Somalis use charcoal as their daily energy needs. So the trade in charcoal still is quite large. We also think, and there may be some still some illicit export, but we're still trying to look at where that happens. But today, most of the revenue streams actually come from the transfer and the taxation. So Al-Shabaab and militant groups will control certain areas. Then there will be movement of natural resources between the different areas, and then Al-Shabaab militant groups will tax the movement of those charcoal routes. So we know then that it's the taxation system is actually a big revenue stream for militant groups, and it's not just charcoal. We can also see it in sugar and also a lot of the transport of other natural resources. So, and we also think that actually in the fishing and the legal fishing trade, there's actually more and more now in terms of some of the taxation happening in that system as well. So we see that natural resources is actually quite a big part of the revenue generation, but it's also part of the control systems as well. So we can see examples of bombing water wells, poisoning water wells, or they will break riverbanks or irrigation canals to try to control populations. So we see that the natural resource and environment is actually a part of the sort of control and financial systems for militant groups.
Thanks, Chris. Kylie, we have one other question which I'd like to direct to you. You've done a lot of work on adaptation, and so it's a question of time horizons. Which climate hazards do you think are most likely to emerge in the short term, and which are likely to take longer to fully unfold? Can you give us a kind of timeline of how you expect these risks to unfold?
First, I should admit that we are in the midst of the climate crisis. It's not a future scenario. In fact, we're already seeing some of these natural hazards born or exacerbated by climate change coming to unfold. And most of these are coming that are sudden onset. So we can see intensification and increasing frequency of things like cyclones. Once in 100-year floods are becoming once in 5-year floods, for instance. So we can already see these sudden onset events coming to bear. Some that are slowly unfolding or unfolding at a slower rate are things like glacial melt, sea level rise, slow onset events such as these. And these happen over a period of time. And, it gives us an opportunity as an international community or different national governments who are experiencing these sorts of effects to intervene over time and to put into place different sorts of intervention. And that's why adaptation is so important, right? We can see these things unfolding slowly. Can we put into place things like more flood resistant or drought resistant crops? Can we establish more efficient irrigation systems to deal with these sorts of creeping climate hazards? And so that would be sort of my take now, is that we are in the midst of the crisis and there's things we can plan for, the things we have to react to.
Thank you. And one last question for Marika. We've built a lot with the risks and the conflicts arising from these climate stress. Is there no way that you see that there is an upside to it, that somehow this is opening ways for people to cooperate more? People are seeing more reason to cooperate, that there are ways of weaving these climatic issues into mediation processes and so forth. Is that something you're seeing any hope in?
Yes, thank you for that question, because it's an element I'd really like to also stress, that we shouldn't overlook how climate change, because it may be a common interest of people living in a certain conflict context, can also bring people together and provide an opportunity for actually a dialogue, peace building, and peace. There we have some encouraging examples, one in an urban environment in Nepal and one in a more also the pastoralist herder example in Darfur, where when designed in the right way, we have collected experience that can actually be done. And to learn from those lessons, what we'd really like to be able to do is to ensure that all these wonderful climate data that we have, that they become much more widely accessible, and that we can help get them into the right hands of people who are around a negotiation table or maybe on different sides of a conflict. So they have an equal understanding of not only what the challenges are, but also where the opportunities for coming to some kind of agreement might be. So in a way, that would also be like the right to access to climate information in a depoliticized manner, and a duty that it is distributed appropriately to reap these opportunities.
Thank you so much, Marika. That's a great note to end on, an uplifting moment after nearly 2 hours of sticking with us. Thanks very much, everyone, for staying with all of us. And you will be receiving a questionnaire from us. Please do fill it in after we've finished. It'll come to you by email, and so we can improve for next time. And in the meantime, I think I will draw this to a close by saying goodbye from me, and Marika, Rob, Chris, Alan, Kaylee, thanks for a fantastic and really enlightening discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.